You knew the product that we were building was enabling people to, talk and communicate in ways that previously hadn't been fathomable. One of the powerful things about VR is the concept of presence and immersion. I mean, that's the promise, right? Is that when you put a VR headset on, you're going to be teleported or transported to another world. And you're competing against places like Facebook or YouTube views, or Twitter views. It does become a struggle, and that in itself was a challenge because you're only limited by your imagination. I mean, I just sort of, when I think about the NextVR team, there wasn't anything which I didn't ask for that they weren't rising to the occasion on.
Welcome to Not the Rob Bell Podcast, where we talk with business owners, marketers, and professionals to extract what makes people and businesses successful.
Hey everyone, and thanks for tuning in to Not the Rob Bell Podcast. Today's guest, I've got Danny Keynes, Senior Vice President of Content at NextVR. They're a leader in immersive virtual reality broadcast of sport and live events. Apple just acquired them for $100 million. We talk about that, content for VR, technical challenges, and so much more. It's coming up now. So Danny Keynes, Senior Vice President of Content at NextVR. Thanks so much for joining us on the podcast today.
Great. Thanks for having me.
And so obviously you're based in the States right now, but you started back here in Australia working for some of the major networks. Can you give us a bit of an insight in where you started?
Yeah, wow, that was a while ago. But I studied actually out of Charles Sturt University in Wagga Wagga. They had a production course out of there, and fortunate enough to land an internship at Channel 9 in Sydney. And during that internship, it was Steve Liebman, Tracy Grimshaw doing the Today Show, and I was the coffee boy. Got to make coffee and tea and do a bunch of stuff, early morning starts, and I was like, living the dream in TV, right? Like, early morning starts, making coffee and tea for the hosts. But and then just sort of worked my way up through the different roles at Channel 9 and ended up doing some really great stuff. But the last stuff I did at 9 was as a producer at 60 Minutes, and it's still one of the best jobs I ever had. It was great. It was filled with really awesome storytelling. Got to travel the world and tell really amazing stories. And I think I felt like I had a great sense of that I was having some sort of impact on the world in that role, and it was a lot of fun.
That's very cool. And I guess you couldn't have really foreseen the path that your career then took maybe at the time. And I understand that you worked at Twitter on your way to NextVR for quite a period of time. Can you give us a bit of an understanding of that pathway?
Yeah, it's funny because with the passage of time, the pathway becomes a lot more apparent. But definitely at the time, I've had many moments in my career where I've sort of thought, wow, it's weird how I ended up here. It's you couldn't have mapped this out or planned for it. And I think that's probably the nature of everyone's career, right? Like, just things happen and opportunities arise, and certainly a lot of luck and a lot of sort of good timing, I suppose, on my behalf when it came to the opportunities. But Twitter was in its very early days, and I was working at Channel 9 at 60 Minutes. And one of the things that they discovered about the platform was that it generated a lot of conversation around television programming. And of course, being a startup and filled with lots of really smart people with technical backgrounds and engineers and developers, they really were looking for people that could try to bridge the gap between technology and the media business. Knowing that there was a core strength of the platform was in that sort of conversation around television programming. So they started looking to bring people into the business that understood the TV mentality, could talk to TV folks, and could forge partnerships between the Twitter product and what was on air. And so they came knocking one day, and I took the leap and started in Australia in the Aussie office, and eventually they moved me across to New York to run sports partnerships for North America. And both the Australian part of that journey and the New York part were incredible, and a great company that had a real impact on the world. And you knew the product that we were building was enabling people to talk and communicate in ways that previously hadn't been fathomable. When it came to things like the Arab Spring, for example, and so that's an uprising. The fact that you could share and communicate globally in a way that never previously been possible was a great sort of thing to be part of.
It's certainly an interesting observation around the difference between, say, a tech company and something very indentured like a big television network. And what were there some sort of unexpected synergies between that transition?
It's weird because when I worked in television, I mean, I worked if it's part of that period, I worked at ESPN as well here in the States. So it had a sort of taste of network television, both, cable in the US and of course network in Australia. Sure. And the thing that frustrated me all the time working in television in both countries was it was very rigid, right? There wasn't a lot of flexibility. These are businesses that have been built for, in some cases they've been around for 50 plus years, and everything has a system. And, by that very nature, at times the job gets frustrating because you want to do things, you want to change things up, you want to make changes, and there's a lot of friction that comes with sort of having those sorts of ideas. And so then when I, moved across to tech, it was very different, right? There was a lot of fluidity. You could, if you wanted to go and do something, you could do it without a ton of oversight. You could make decisions around the sorts of things you wanted to do, and very little pushback. And a lot of the mentality was just, a bias to yes, let's go and do it. Let's see, what will come of it. But very, very quickly, I had these moments about 2 years in where I was like, oh, I kind of miss the structure of the TV business. I miss the sort of like the mentality of like, there's a process and this is how it gets done and this is what you do and this is who approves it. And that stuff was, because it gets tiring, right? Like it gets tiring to try and navigate those conversations where there isn't the structure in place. And so there's the push and pull of both. I can't imagine I thrive more in the latter, which is the just go and do it, the startup mentality. And I feel like if I look at my career, it goes from sort of the network mentality through to the Twitter mentality, which was still a relatively large company by the time I joined, right down the funnel to the NextVR piece, which is, a really, really small startup that was, had big plans, but didn't have a lot of structure at all.
And so I think that's a really interesting change where you've gone from super rigid to very, very flexible. But then when you've entered VR, which is really on the cutting edge of content production, it's essentially like the wild, wild west where almost anything goes because you're sort of making up the rules as you go, right?
Yeah. I mean, that was the great challenge in the early days of VR has been that there are no precedents for the deals you put together. The way that content gets created, it gets syndicated or it gets distributed is new. And so, part of the challenge in that is you're not just trying to explain to people how to use the technology and the impact it can have on the end user, but a lot of the time you're actually also just trying to explain the business model. And that's the real challenge, because in television, the distribution models and the content syndication models already exist. It's sort of the front end of creating content that is where sort of a lot of the conversation takes place. The rest of it just gets spat out through the traditional pipelines, be it in networks or to cable or to VOD or SVOD or whatever it is. In VR, it's like, it is very challenging, but that was also what was the most exciting part of the job.
And so we'll come back to the production challenges for VR in a second, but for someone who's not too familiar with NextVR as a company and what you're trying to do, can you give us the rundown of what the business case is and what they're all about?
Yeah, so NextVR, the global leader in broadcasting live events in virtual reality, and so our one of the powerful things about VR is the concept of presence and immersion. I mean, that's the promise, right? Is that when you put a VR headset on, when you experience content, you're going to be teleported or transported to another world, and there's been a ton of inherent problems with that promise, which we can get into, but just to sort of wrap up your question, that's what we did, right? That's it. Ultimately, we would put people courtside at a live NBA game. We put you, on the goalposts at an NFL game. We'd put you behind the goals in an ice hockey game, and we'd put you front row at a Live Nation concert, with a band, or we would take you behind the scenes of a World of Dance, extravaganza. We'd put you front row with the Moscow Ballet for the Great Russian Nutcracker. The concept being that when you're in our experiences, you feel like you're there. And that opened up this world of sort of giving people the best seat in the house. And sometimes a seat that money can't buy, right? Like for one of our live NBA games, the camera's position was below the stanchion, so the basket was just above you. And that in itself is a seat that even if you had, an amazing amount of money, you couldn't buy that seat because it doesn't exist. So we basically would teleport people into live events and give them access that they can't get any other way.
It's very cool, and I'm a huge fan of VR and new tech in this space. Was there obviously we've touched on it a little bit between the difference between a tech company and a network, and obviously sporting is something which NextVR is a huge part of. Were there some challenges there in terms of either conflict with indentured providers like ESPN, or was there a benefit to Springboard there?
Yeah, so that is a question laced with complexity, and the reason for it is because it's a dance. I mean, look, it would be a challenge occasionally from a production perspective because we would occasionally be chasing the same camera positions, but at the same time, our camera technology did have the ability to take out what we're producing and send it to a host broadcast feed for traditional live broadcasts. So we could service the traditional host broadcasters at the same time as doing the NextVR broadcast. The networks here are pretty savvy when it comes to VR. Most of them have got some sort of platform now or are starting to produce content. Turner Broadcasting does live NBA games as well. There's a lot of sort of it's been a slow burn, but there's a lot of traction now in the space, and it's become easier now than it was, say, 4 years ago when we started doing live NBA games, because back then there was a lot less awareness for the sort of VR ecosystem and the value proposition of the medium.
Of course. And so from a production consideration as a content creator, are there some real key challenges that come with producing content for VR that don't exist when you're basically pointing a camera and dictating the process?
Yeah, there's a couple. So the one of the key ones really is camera position. So the cameras don't zoom. So that's the big difference really between traditional broadcast and a VR broadcast. In VR, we put you where the camera is positioned. Now, in traditional broadcast, you can have a camera at the back of an arena and it can zoom right in and get a close-up of Steph Curry on the sideline, and it's a great shot. In VR, you put the camera at the back of the arena and you feel like you're sitting in the cheap seats at the back of the arena. So camera position is definitely important. One of the things which a lot of the content produced was we would just focus on the front 180. We wouldn't shoot a full 360. There is a lot of reasons for doing that. Mainly for us, it was about camera position. So if we look at our broadcasts and think where people are spending a lot of their time watching, it's always where the narrative is. And the narrative is always in front of you, right? Like it's the sports event in front of you. No one's looking behind them at the crowd or the people eating popcorn or having a beer behind them. Occasionally they might look, but reality is you're always looking forward. And so we wouldn't produce a full 360. We'd produce the 180, so we could put our cameras in positions where we didn't have to really worry too much about what was behind. So we wouldn't be compromising from a camera position perspective for something that people are very rarely going to look at. And we'd use the back of the broadcast as a graphics interface where we'd put team matchups and logos and just have it as a virtual world.
Sure. And because I think it's a very interesting thing as a user to have a different perspective when you're watching VR content, because traditional TV is a very passive activity, but VR is super active. And
yeah, I mean, you can get this is something which I'm actually quite I actually get quite passionate about, this topic of sort of the interactivity and the sort of the value that VR can bring to a broadcast versus the sort of the one-way communication with TV that people traditionally have. When I started in VR, I was very much about sort of the interactivity, the ability for people to choose their own adventure, the ability for people to move around and experience, sort of ability that how you could look at storytelling differently. But I changed my opinion on it pretty significantly through that time. So in the early days, I was watching as much VR content as possible. I was watching everything that was being released. I was spending hours in the headset and it's on any given day sometimes, and just really consuming a lot of stuff. And then one Sunday, I went to the movies and I sat down in the movie theater with my popcorn, and I just had this sense of like, oh, I can't wait to just be told the story. Like, just sit back and not have to work to be told the story. And it was this sort of epiphany I had, which was that actually storytelling shouldn't be hard. Like, if you give people options, if you give people too much, if you put them too much in control of the story, it actually isn't fun anymore. You have to make decisions. You have to worry about things. Yeah, and so as a storyteller, it's actually better or as someone who's so being told a story. It's actually better if you can just sit back and be told the story. So I think that the value proposition of VR actually isn't all those things which originally, and a lot of people still think it is. I think it's still very much about the presence and immersion that comes with with a VR broadcast and the technology.
I think it's an interesting observation, and we've obviously seen on traditional 2D platforms things such as Netflix story mode, interactive series and that sort of thing. Do you feel that VR content delivery is almost like a better version of 3D TV as opposed to super interactive?
I'm not a fan of the comparison between sort of 3D TV and VR. The thing, and mainly because 3D sort of is laced with this, or tainted with this sort of like the industry didn't really like flourish, right? It came and it went. There was a lot of friction with 3D TV, and most importantly, there wasn't enough value proposition. So you could, it's kind of cool, right? Like, it's all right, but you got to put the 3D glasses on. Your TV, you had to work from one angle. There wasn't enough content, and it just wasn't worth the effort. VR is very, very different, but although the analogies continue, I hear them all the time. And the reality is that like the VR will by far in time be the only place to watch content, because what it gives you. There is a ton of really, really bad VR content out there today, right? And that's part of the problem. When I say the industry's had a slow burn, inevitably the industry will flourish, and it'll be amazing. It'll be like everyone will be, all these sort of doomsdayers around VR will eventually peter out. But the analogy I like to use is it's the year's 1996, and I'm telling you that I'm building Netflix, right? The reality is in 1996, you couldn't download an image from the internet, let alone HD movie, right? So it's going to take years. The technology is slowly getting there, but it's going to be far superior than any other way of storytelling or content consumption that exists today.
And I think that's an interesting perspective with the role that technology does play in anything that's cutting edge like this. Are there some challenges that you struck trying to do something when you are on the bleeding edge of content creation that even the best and greatest VR hardware can't cater for? Yeah,
generate revenue. I mean, look, it's a, and I mean that with, I joke about it, but it was a struggle, and at times, and it actually wasn't a struggle because the audience wasn't there. It's a struggle because of the advertising business doesn't understand it. So when when you have a new medium that doesn't have like the metrics that people are used to, that doesn't have the sort of like way of measuring ROI that exists today, and you're competing against places like Facebook or or YouTube views or Twitter views, it does become a struggle. And that in itself was a challenge. The hardware piece, less so. I think the form factor is getting better. I think there were certainly platforms that far exceeded and delivered well beyond what we thought they would do, and there are certain platforms that underwhelmed us as a business. PlayStation VR, very strong, continued to drive lots of growth for the business. Oculus with the Oculus with the Rift and the Go and the Quest later on. Less so sort of a Google Daydream, which was released a couple of years ago. I think they may have even discontinued that now. That's how sort of insignificant that device ended up being for our business. Might still be around, even though it was Google. But yeah, so but the thing about the strange thing about the hardware cycles in VR is they're super fast. I mean, Oculus released the Oculus Go in April last year, and then towards the end of the year they launched the Quest, right, which was the new standalone 6 degrees of freedom all-in-one headset, which was the first of its kind in the market. A stunning device, and really I wish in a sense it was the first device ever released, because the problem that VR had in the early days is that was this concept of the promise of VR was meant to be amazing, but people will put on an old headset, the Samsung VR or the Google Cardboard, and they go, oh, like, that's VR? And the reality was, like, I was saying the same thing. I was like, this can be so much better. The world is experiencing this VR craze, and they're all experiencing really terrible VR content. It's making them sick. You know, it's not high quality. It's done by independent producers who don't know anything about storytelling. You know, this year with the release of the Quest and the content that's coming to the platform, I've had many times when I've said, I wish this was the first device that had ever been released, because this is the sort of killer device for VR in general.
It's, I mean, technical limitations always play an interesting role. You know, we've had a long history of involvement in, say, web development and things, and we were always at the mercy of the browser. And you sort of have to design for that lowest common denominator in some regards. Do you think that's why maybe VR gaming is perhaps more popular in some regards, because it is tied to that higher end of the available hardware? Yeah,
I think that it's funny. I think that so there's a lot of friction still to get into VR, right? Like, if you think about it, to watch a TV show, I mean, actually, let me rewind that thought for a second, because really the thing is we're all chasing the same eyeballs, right? Like that, and in VR, that's the same thing. I mean, we're doing live NBA games, but those live NBA games are available on someone's tablet, they're available on someone's mobile, they're available on someone's television, they're available on the radio, right? And so we're all chasing the same. We're just trying to be the best place to watch the game, right? And so that in itself becomes inherently like the challenge was always saying, how do we? The only way that we would win is if we are the best place to watch an NBA game. That's the reality of if we're the second best place to watch, well, we're not going to get those eyeballs, because fans are always going to gravitate to the best place to watch their team play. And so we spend a lot of time as a business, like, thinking about what are the things that we can do to try and keep people in a headset, that we can get them to put the headset on, keep them in the experience, and for them to be as less friction as possible. Hardware limitations aside, which, you know, battery power and all that sort of stuff come into you have to factor them in. But one of the things which we started to do was, we thought originally with our production that we could just stream an NBA game and put somebody courtside and that would be enough, right? The concept being present and immersed, sitting courtside at a live NBA game, never, you know, what an experience. What we quickly discovered is that, like, sports broadcasting specifically is very difficult because fans demand certain things, right? They actually don't want to just sit courtside. They want to know, why is my team winning? Why is my team losing? What's the score? They want to know the game clock. They want to know the shot clock. They want to know, why is my favorite player no longer on the court? They want to know, you know, all the sort of stuff that commentary brings, the slow motion replay technology, everything that's been built for traditional TV broadcast has only been built for traditional TV broadcast because fans have demanded it, right? Like, replay technology is there because that's what fans wanted. Color, audio, all this stuff that came in, advances in technology were sort of, you know, tried and sometimes passed on, but often continued with because it made the broadcast better. So we had to layer all that stuff into our broadcast. So when you think about a live NBA game, we'd have slow motion replays in VR. We'd have like stats and data and graphics that would all come in that would help give you context around the game.
So while the technology is very different for what you're producing, the production approach perhaps became more closely aligned?
Yeah, very, very much so. I mean, the team that was producing live NBA games were a traditional TV crew that I'd recruited from Fox Sports and ESPN and a bunch of places, and some Aussies actually from Wild Sports in Sydney as well came to join. So we had a team of people, but the skill set was the same. There's minor nuances, but ultimately the two things that are different are the camera technology and the feed you're spitting out of the arena that goes to a headset, right? Everything in between that is essentially a broadcast production.
Yeah, of course. And certainly there's some very specific things that you need to cater for with sport broadcasts, as you mentioned. How does that differ for, say, something like a live event, a ballet, as you suggested at the start?
Yeah, so less camera cutting. Like, one of the things, so every time in VR that you cut from, like, TV cameras, right, would cut, TV broadcasts would cut constantly, right? Different angles, replays, that stuff. actually, it's counterintuitive because in VR, what you're trying to do is create this sense of presence and immersion, which we've talked a little bit about. But every time you cut a camera, you break presence, right? It's actually counterintuitive. You feel like you're sitting courtside. Now you're no longer sitting there. You're sitting behind a stanchion. So in something like the ballet, we tend to just do a single camera production. We put you front row. You don't need to cut cameras a lot. You just enjoy the show. With the same for a live music concert, probably just 3. NBA would be like 8 to 10 cameras. The theatre will be like 1. A Live Nation concert with a big artist in like a House of Blues or stadium style show, probably 3 cameras is enough.
So when you're, obviously when we go to a live event such as ballet or theatre or something like that, there's so much sort of spatial perception in the audio side as well. Does that require some specific handling that you maybe don't have to worry about with sporting?
Yeah, so spatial audio is super important because it's a big part of the product ultimately, and you need to definitely give consideration to sort of like because you are ultimately in 3D space the whole time, so it can't be mono and it needs to be spatial. So if something's happening over here, it needs to happen over here. If something's over here, you need to. So special mic technology and then special software as well.
Interesting challenges from a technology perspective, no doubt.
I was just going to say, I mean, interesting challenges that unfortunately I didn't need to solve. I worked with some of the smartest people I've worked with in my career. I mean, these people, like you present them with a problem and they solve it. And I'm like, I don't know how they do it, but they do it. I mean, that's what they do. And my mind was blown every day. These sort of people who would just like challenge. You know, I could put incredible challenges to them and they'd find ways to solve issues, which was such a great bunch of people to work with.
And how cool is that as a content creator to basically imagine something that you maybe can't do right now and go to them with a problem and say, can you solve this?
Yeah, I mean, look, I presented some really like crazy sort of like wacky ideas to engineers and technicians over the last couple of years, and they never failed to deliver. I mean, that's the crazy thing about it. Now, a lot of those ideas were terrible, frankly, but the fact that they took them and then ran with them to explore what it would look like was so empowering because I kind of felt like nothing was ever impossible.
It's certainly a powerful position to be in as a content creator, where you're not just using the tools, you can develop the tools that you need. Definitely very cool. So if we shift gears a little bit and we look forward in VR and say in terms of regular business applications, we saw the evolution of regular video, say 10 years ago, really kick off, and it's still happening now. How do you see VR playing a role in regular business content delivery?
Yeah, so there's a couple of things on this. So there's a whole industry emerging, which is on sort of with workforce sort of B2B sort of applications for VR, training technology. If I think about a few of them, there's a great one, which is there's a company here in the US that is doing this. So if you're trying to, when you're on a building site and you're using like massive, like big hardware, cranes and tractors and all that sort of stuff, people need to be trained on that equipment often, and that equipment is super expensive. So a lot of the time it's more productive to have that equipment, of course, on site working to do the construction. But a lot of the time some of that equipment needs to come off for training sessions to train, future employees. And it costs the business, right? Because it's not really being used for what it should be. And that's sort of, there's a shift in that whole industry now, which is doing the training in VR. So the sort of big machinery can stay on the construction site, and then the final parts of the sort of training process actually happens on site where the construction's taking place. And there's a ton of that stuff that's going on where it becomes sort of very applicable to medical as well, like training doctors to do surgery and those sorts of things. The key to all of that is just it's really applicable to a ton of industries, but I feel like the ones where it's like most applicable to medical, certainly construction for sure. I think there's teaching applications that I haven't seen a lot of stuff explored in this space, but I I can't imagine a world where it doesn't get a lot of traction, because one of the things about VR that it allows, there's a sort of sense of empathy that comes with the VR experience that you don't get from just looking at traditional pictures or video, right? We shot I'm very passionate about the homeless issues here in Los Angeles, and so much so that we did a VR documentary called Homeless, a Los Angeles story last year. And the motivation behind that was because there's 65,000 homeless here in Los Angeles who you see all the time, right? And the problem's getting worse. And you're driving down the freeway on any given day, and these people just become sort of a blur to your life. And to a lot of people, they just become an annoyance, right?
Sure,
because they're camped out. And so I thought, these are real human beings that have a story and that had a life. They've just hit a bit of bad luck, right? And they're, but for the grace of, it could be you or I, right? It's not hard in this day and age to strike a little bit of bad luck and be able to not, make ends meet and end up there. Yep. So we shot for 3 nights on the streets of LA with these homeless people trying to tell their story, and it got selected for the New York Film Festival last year, which was great. But it was all about trying to bring some sort of empathy to these to the crisis that is a very different perspective, and only VR can do that, because it doesn't matter how many news stories that you watch around the homeless crisis. Putting somebody in a tent with a homeless person at night in the streets of LA in VR is a very, very powerful moment, and that's the stuff that really, when I think about the future of VR and I think about the storytelling abilities, there's no medium that's ever existed that is as powerful as VR for that.
And do you think there's an underappreciated eventuality that's going to come along where businesses can utilize that immersive and really strong experience to build empathy with a customer when they're trying to sell a product, for instance? So
we did a lot of work in the branded space for products with MasterCard as one of the people we work very closely with, and so it was a way of creating. They have these experience centers that are all over the world where you can sort of go in and sort of touch and feel the MasterCard products. It's a B2B sort of play. And we work with them to create those experience centers immersively. And I think they recognized very quickly after we finished the sort of first slate of content that the physical experience centers, which they've spent probably tens of millions of dollars building, could be redundant in the future, because they could just do all this stuff immersively, right? Like send somebody a VR headset or let them come somewhere to experience it without having to put the cost into the physical building, because it doesn't just do the same thing, it does it better, right? That concept of being able to touch and feel things in VR, or certainly play with those their products. It's the same sorts of things that you could do in the physical center, except you don't have the cost of running a physical space.
It's certainly interesting, and we've seen some experimentation in guided tours of certain areas, and some really unique experiments in this space as well. Certainly when you look at the economic change between creating a physical experience center versus, as you say, sending a headset to participants, the cost dynamic of VR and overcoming those technological hurdles will change pretty drastically, won't it? Yeah. I mean, there's the thing is and this is inherent with any industry as it's emerging. I mean, VR production's still relatively expensive, right? Like to produce the development technology. I mean, we there's a ton of money that went into the into the business just trying to create stuff, because everything we were building, essentially building from scratch, right? Like there's no real sort of like infrastructure in place like there is, say, in traditional broadcast, where there's been camera companies around for many years building this stuff. There's a supply chain of content and a supply chain of hardware, and that'll change over time. And of course, there becomes more, the camera technology becomes better. There becomes more sort of off-the-shelf rigs that people can buy, and the distribution platforms as well become more sort of available. And certainly, there's a tech challenge with VR content at the moment in terms of bandwidth, and we see that with 4K content still struggling, but perhaps not so much in LA. Certainly in Australia, regardless of NBN technology. Even now on a 720p Zoom call, we can see fragmentation and things like that. How far does that technology have to come to really enable, live stream VR in a really broad sense?
Yeah, it's a good question. I look, the 5G will change a lot for VR because it's more pixels. With more pixels comes more bandwidth to get better resolution. If you don't have enough bandwidth, you don't have enough pixels, it's just a shitty experience, right? And it's less forgiving than a traditional medium because you're basically trying to trick the brain into thinking that you've been teleported somewhere else. And so what ends up happening is when you have a bad VR experience, your brain picks up on things, and it's sort of the push and pull of it is there'll be like a tear line, or there'll be something which doesn't match in the experience, and it breaks that sense of immersion. So it's more important than ever. It's not just like a glitch on a video call, right? It's a glitch in your world, and at its worst, it can make you sick. But when it's good, it's amazing, right? And that's the sort of challenge there. But 5G will help. I mean, I think that you would want for a high quality, high resolution VR experience, you need at least 20 megabit of bandwidth, certainly for NextVR content. If you had anything below 7 or 8 megs, you might as well not bother trying, right? Because it's just not going to be, the quality will be terrible. So there are challenges that I think 5G will help solve, but we'll see, because there's also, there's a lot of challenges around 5G in general, and that is like just being able to, the network capabilities, right? Doesn't travel through walls, doesn't travel at speed, and all that stuff, which will be challenges we all have to face in whatever industry we're in.
Do you think, if we come back to NextVR as a company briefly, we know from the reports that it's just been sold to Apple for $100 million, but we also know that there was more than that in terms of investment that went into NextVR. Do you think part of that, even though there's been massive inroads in producing sporting content and all the technology and everything that you've done really successfully, is it still being held back by some of those technical limitations and maybe hampers that business case overall?
I don't know whether it's so. I don't necessarily think it's being held back by those technical limitations. I think that the challenge is that there's not enough audience there for it to be a priority for a lot of the businesses that will be most successful using it. So if you think about a network like NBC deals in, tens of millions of viewers on any given night, right? Like that's a benchmark for them for success is, 7, 8, 10 million viewers to a primetime show. The challenge for them is when they think about investing core time, energy, and money into VR, is that the return for them is probably tens of thousands of viewers, right? At best now. And so you over time that'll change, but that's really inherently the once again that sort of push and pull of the medium is that when there's enough audience and enough devices, then there'll be a much more better sort of uptake from media companies and sports leagues. The challenge is that without their buy-in, there isn't the great content that sends people to buy the hardware. It's the equivalent of, no one goes and buys a television unless there's something they want to watch. And so the challenge has been for VR, a lot of really crappy content that isn't actually VR that plays in a VR headset. So in my time, I've met a lot of people who tell me that, VR's not for me, I get motion sick, right? Or it made me sick. It's like, actually, there's no VR experience in the world that'll make you sick. What'll make you sick is 2D 360 video in a headset that is meant for YouTube, right? The idea of like, if you're ever in a VR headset and your world is moving and you're not, so let's say someone strapped a 360 camera to the front of a BMX and they went riding on it, right? Or you're in a parade or a march and you're filming yourself moving along. That stuff will play in a VR headset, a 360 video player. But when you put that on and your world moves and you're not moving, it's car sickness, right? That's exactly what happens is you feel ill. real VR is not that, but true VR is like you control the experience, right? Like when you move, your world moves, just like it happens, to any human being, and that's challenging because it's very rare to find that content still today that is really good, high quality content. And so Samsung in the early days, had their Samsung Gear VR and their Samsung phone, and they had their camera hardware line of 360 videos and all that stuff, and they bundled it all together and they just tried to sell it all together. People creating all this awesome content, putting in a VR headset, and ultimately it should never have been in a VR headset in the first place because it wasn't VR, right? It was just 360 video. So that's been one of the limitations, is people thinking that they've experienced VR and they actually never experienced VR. They just put a headset on with crappy content.
And so do you think that from a smaller business, so we talked about MasterCard as obviously a global enterprise taking on this challenge, do you think there's a role for smaller businesses to try and make some inroads into producing VR content, or do you think it's just too early?
No, I think there's an appetite for that. All of the major hardware platforms, platforms. If you think about VR, just for anyone listening who isn't sort of familiar with the VR ecosystem, with every VR headset is produced by a manufacturer who will have like an app store that lives on that headset. So similar to if you've got an Android phone, it's the Google Play Store. If you've got an iOS device, it's the App Store. In VR, if you've got a PlayStation VR, it's the PlayStation Store. If you've got an Oculus device, it's the Oculus Store, right? But there's a ton of opportunity still for early, because it's still so early, there's a ton of opportunity for people to create content or create devices or applications that sit in their stores that still can get featured, that can still drive a ton of downloads because there aren't enough apps to, we're not talking, there aren't millions of apps in VR yet, right? There's probably hundreds of good ones. And so if you build something or create content that is really interesting, you'll probably get featured. And you'll find that a lot of those hardware manufacturers might even chase you down to ensure that you've got their content or your app on their platform.
So the chicken and egg challenge that still exists in the VR space could actually be an opportunity in disguise.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's like the early days of the iOS App Store, right, where people were making. I remember at my time at 60 Minutes, we did a story on app millionaires. There's this one guy who created this a flashlight for your phone, and it was before, obviously, a lot of those devices now come with a flashlight.
Yeah.
Made $35 million. $35 million from just downloads of turning the phone screen into a torch. And that opportunity still exists, now in VR. The scale isn't there yet with that many people to make 35 million, but certainly the opportunity to build that stuff now with the future in mind is where it's at.
It's certainly an interesting observation, and I think we all remember the multi-million-dollar fart app that made headlines as well. So it's so for we're starting to run out of time, but I do have a couple of questions that I'd love to get across. If you had to think around the VR space and its evolution, do you think there's sort of a timeline for when it will become much more widely adopted, or do you think it'll just be a slow ramp?
It's a good question. I think I always thought 2021 would be like the year. I'd meet people who would constantly talk about like next year, and after 5 years in VR, I always thought like 21, 22 was sort of like the going to be the turning point for the technology for a few reasons. Bandwidth, we know. 5G is incredibly important just to be able to get good experiences. Form factor on the devices, and one of the big challenges for VR was this concept of 6 degrees of freedom. So until just recently, in order to truly experience VR, you needed to have a headset that was tethered to a computer, right? Because it needed that much power to enable the sort of the ability to have this 6 degrees of freedom, which is sort of to be able to move around your world. Oculus released the Quest, and it was the first device that had what you call inside-out tracking. So the cameras and the hard drive that used to sit around your house and around your room to track you now sit on the device. So the cameras sit here. There's enough, all the computer powering is packed into the device, and all you do now is pick it up, put it on, and you're away. And you can move around those experiences. was the first. I think PlayStation probably have plans to do something similar. They've got the PlayStation VR at the moment, still has a cord that's tethered to the PlayStation console. They'll cut that cord with the next iteration of that device for sure. Maybe before Christmas this year, but likely definitely out before Christmas next year. And I think those two devices having such market share will start to sort of really get the entire industry traction, because I can now travel. Doing demos and traveling with my VR headset was a pain forever, right? Until the Quest came out, and then I could just put it in my backpack and go, right? And that to me, solving that pain point, even from a business perspective, I know that for the end user, being able to just put a device on and not have to worry about anything else makes the experience more enjoyable.
Are there any aspects of VR as a content creator that you would love to problem solve, but the technology might take even further than that to really solve those problems? Something that someone like myself couldn't consider?
I think that the challenge still is in. So the short answer is no, but I would be, and because you're only limited by your imagination. I mean, I just sort of, when I think about the NextVR team, there wasn't anything which I didn't ask for that they couldn't, that I could conjure up creatively, that they weren't rising to the occasion on, right? I think the challenge is that I used to talk about this quite a lot, is that Hollywood hasn't come to VR. And what I mean by that is quality storytelling, quality content needs to come into the space. So a lot of the space still today has been independent storytellers, independent producers, people experimenting with content, people trying to do new and interesting things with storytelling because it's a new medium. And I'm a big believer in that actually you can't overthink it. Storytelling hasn't changed in hundreds of years, right? Stories have a beginning, they have a middle, and they have an end, and they're told to you. And I don't necessarily believe that has to change in VR. I just think that the focus needs to be about making people feel more present in the storytelling.
Yeah, I think certainly once Hollywood figures that out and cracks that nut, then it will be a catalyst for huge change. There's been some good. I mean, Hollywood's done some great experiences. There's some great Marvel experiences out there. There's Coco that Disney did. There's sort of short form storytelling. There's a lot of location-based experiences here in the US too that The Void do. There's a Star Wars experience. A lot of that stuff there was available on that Quest device because of the freedom you have. And that's the stuff that really inspires me. There's a boxing game that you can get in the ring with Apollo Creed, and there's that sort of stuff which is now starting to come, which is making it much more they're more sort of killer apps for VR that didn't exist say 12 months ago. Yeah, sure. And so obviously NextVR's sold to Apple, and probably can't touch too much about what their plans are, even if you're aware of them. But do you think there's an opportunity for us to see something in the VR space similar to when Apple released the iPhone and revolutionized the mobile phone?
Yeah, I think that there's every tech company worth its salt on the planet right now is pouring billions of dollars into VR. I mean, you look at what Facebook did when they purchased Oculus for $2 billion a couple of years ago. You look at what Microsoft's doing with HoloLens. You look at all the investment that's going into a company like Magic Leap. It's like they've raised $3 billion in capital. You think about the stuff that PlayStation and Sony are doing. And Apple's just doing what everybody else is doing, and that is recognizing that VR and AR is going to be a huge part of how the world ticks right in the future, and I'm excited to see what they all do. I mean, there couldn't have been a better company on the planet really for the NextVR technology to land at than one of the big tech companies, and it's going to be great to see how it all evolves.
And obviously, I mean, Apple really transformed themselves into the $1 trillion company that on the basis of the iPhone. So now, no doubt, they are looking for that next nugget, even though nobody knows what it's quite going to look like yet. So it's certainly an interesting thing to watch. And so we are out of time, but is there anything that you would love to share with our audience around VR, anything they can be doing to sort of prepare for that next generation of content?
No, I mean, the only thing is if you tried VR in the past and it, you made you motion sick, or you didn't like it, or you thought you experienced it, I just try it again, because a lot has changed. The devices have changed, the form factor's changed, they're more accessible, the content is better, and I think you'll be pleasantly surprised.
So give it another red hot shot, even if you thought it was not so great at the start. Certainly good advice. Yeah. Well, Danny Keens, it's been a fantastic chat, and I really look forward to seeing what happens with yourself and VR in the future. If someone wants to connect with you as a content creator, where can they find out more about you?
They can just follow me on Twitter. My DMs are always open. So at Danny, DANNY, KEENS. And yeah, I'm happy to field any messages.
Awesome. Danny Keens, thank you so much for your time.
Great. Thanks a lot.
There you have it. I hope you really enjoyed this episode. And if you did, please like it, share it, or leave us a review on your favorite platform. It helps us show more of this content to people just like you.